When we listen to speech sounds and transcribe them in IPA, we're engaging in a specific type of phonetic analysis, which we call impressionistic analysis or auditory analysis. Impressionistic analysis is usually the first type of phonetic analysis you learn as a linguist, and until very recently, when phonetic analyses were applied in linguistic subfields like sociolinguistics, it was normally through impressionistic analysis. For instance, when Bill LeBeau walked through New York City department stores asking workers questions that would make them say fourth floor, he was capturing simply whether he heard them pronounce a consonantal R or not. And impressionistic studies still appear. For instance, Clark and Asprey's 2014 book includes a description of the West Midlands English phonological inventory, which appears to be based entirely on impressionistic coding, as does Braber and Robinson's 2018 volume on East Midlands English. In fact, there are very good reasons to continue doing impressionistic analysis. Besides being resource non-intensive, relatively quick, and very well suited to studies of natural speech, when a linguist listens to speech and indicates what they heard, that matches the way hearers actually encounter speech in real language. A particularly important point to this is that as we progress through our lessons, we'll at times encounter the need to normalize our measurements of speech samples. Normalization here will refer to processes that try to eliminate differences in speech sounds that result from things like physiological differences in the sizes of speakers' vocal tracts, but which don't affect linguistic meaning. For instance, young children naturally have smaller vocal tracts than adults, and as a result, the frequencies of the speech sounds that children produce are necessarily much higher than the frequencies of the exact same perceptual sounds that adults create. But while we do perceive children's voices as being higher in pitch than adults, we nevertheless correctly perceive the segments that they are producing as if they were the same segments as those produced by adults, even though they are objectively very clearly different. These kinds of objective differences will make comparison of acoustic speech quite difficult, and we'll have to perform complex mathematical transformations to measurements in order to eliminate differences in measurements that arise only from physiological differences between speakers, which are not linguistically meaningful, while at the same time maintaining differences that are linguistically meaningful or are socio-linguistically meaningful. And any such normalization routine always reflects a compromise between these goals. But the human ear and human brain perform normalization automatically and with ridiculous accuracy. So when we do impressionistic coding, we are taking advantage of the greatest phonetic normalizer that has ever existed. Nevertheless, there are also good reasons to move beyond impressionistic analysis and toward instrumental analysis. One of these is that same built-in normalizer can get in the way of our work as analysts. Close phonetic analysis reveals tremendous variation in segmental production, so that even the same speaker saying the same sound repeatedly will say that sound in different objective ways time after time. But the normalization routine of our brain will tend to process out a lot of those differences. These differences may or may not be important, but we can only determine which ones are important if we capture them. Relatedly, our own phonetic and phonological systems will naturally influence what we are actually able to hear and able to code. An important sound change, for instance, in British English is the merger of the interdental fricatives with the labiodental fricatives, so that th and v sound the same as f and v. If you are trying to study this sound change and you yourself don't distinguish between interdental and labiodental fricatives, it will naturally be very difficult for you to differentiate between th and f or v and v very accurately and reliably. In fact, the auditory difference specifically between the interdental fricatives and labiodental fricatives is so small that most people will struggle to differentiate and code them accurately and reliably. And indeed, another problem with impressionistic analysis is that some phonetic differences are so small that they can't reliably be heard by the human ear. But still, they may matter over time or matter in an immediate social situation. For instance, during my work in Kansas City, I found a gradual change in the vowels in words like price place that was taking place over time. The change was so small that if you compared two speakers who were born within 10 or 20 years of each other, they would sound like they had the same vowels. But over 5 or 6 generations, that gradual change built up to a point that a major sound change had taken place. So even though speakers couldn't consciously hear the sound change, it was nevertheless advancing, meaning that they were actually unconsciously hearing it and building their phonological inventories accordingly to continue the advance of that sound change. If I had only been listening for it, it would have seemed that the sound change just appeared out of nowhere at the moment where it crossed into the threshold where that difference became perceptually salient. And finally, some aspects of productions just can't be seen or heard at all because they're taking place inside the body. These facts give us good reasons to turn from impressionistic analysis to instrumental analysis. In instrumental analysis, we use technologies to objectively observe and measure the speech signal or the actual articulatory structures of the body. As the name implies, instrumental analysis involves using instruments to study phonetic productions. Instrumental analysis will always involve some kind of equipment being employed to take measurements. Different types of instruments will be appropriate to different research questions and research contexts. In general, though, the benefits to instrumental analysis are that they allow us to study aspects of phonetic productions that are invisible to us, either literally or metaphorically, and that they are replicable. Replicable, in this case, means that we capture a record of the phonetic event. We can reproduce that event by following the same research protocols at different times, and we can agree on a set of measurement protocols that we can apply and use to derive roughly the same measurements of those phonetic events. Traditionally, instrumental analysis is further divided between acoustic analysis and articulatory analysis. Acoustic analysis examines the product of phonetic articulations, the sound waves created by speech. Articulatory analysis examines the physiological structures that create speech sounds, so actually observing the state of the vocal cords, the air passing through the oral and nasal cavities, or the movements of articulators. Acoustic and articulatory analysis aren't just subdivisions of instrumental analysis. If we're doing impressionistic analysis, listening to sounds and transcribing them represents a form of acoustic analysis, and reflecting on the shapes and movements of the articulators while saying those sounds is articulatory analysis. So acoustic and articulatory analysis are categories of all phonetic analysis and not just instrumental analysis. But with instrumental analysis, it's very easy to see how we're dealing with different aspects of linguistic sound. A third area of study that is emerging in phonetic research in instrumental domains is neural analysis, where researchers observe activity of the brain during production or perception of phonetic units. It seems very likely that the increasing ability to measure other physiological feedback mechanisms, such as the cardiorespiratory system or the glandular endocrinial system, will be incorporated into phonetic research as well. It's easy to imagine, for instance, studies that monitor responses of the endocrine system to hearing utterances that violate phonological or sociolinguistic expectations. These might lead to a broader category of physiological phonetic analysis that could incorporate articulatory analyses plus the broader human organic capacity for creating and processing sound. So the fundamental distinction in phonetic analysis generally and in instrumental analysis specifically is whether we're dealing with the sonic outputs of language or the physical structures of the human body. We'll spend most of our laboratory time this term in the domain of acoustic analysis. There's good reason for this. The widespread availability of computers and programs like PROT have made acoustic analysis widely available and very accessible to linguists. Acoustic analysis is also the easiest instrumental analytic approach for subfields like sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, speech pathology, and forensic linguistics to employ. However, acoustic analysis is a limited tool because it can only show us the products of articulatory gestures and can tell us nothing about the actual gestures that created them. This means we're ignorant of differences in articulatory gestures that produce similar acoustic profiles. We're ignorant of gestures that occur in silence, and we're backwards constructing what the articulatory gestures must have been to create a particular sound wave. This is analogous to studying a car that you see in the street in order to describe the factory that created it. As such, phoneticians and laboratory phonologists make use of a broader range of tools to more directly observe actual articulations. While our practical focus this term will be on acoustic analysis, in many ways the frontiers of phonetic and phonological research are in articulatory and other areas of physiological analysis. The most traditional type of articulatory analysis is palatography. In palatography, an informant has a dye painted on their tongue and produces a single segment for a researcher. The contact between the tongue and other articulators transfers dye from the tongue to that transfer site, and then a picture, traditionally taken by putting a mirror in the informant's mouth, is taken of that transfer site to see where the articulatory contact occurred. In this demonstration, I'm using a dye made from charcoal powder and olive oil, and then producing a segment of "d" in a vowel-consonant-vowel frame. Since there's no contact between the articulators during the vowels, no dye is transferred during these segments, and the VCV frame allows a slightly more natural production than I would get if I produced just the consonant in isolation. Ada, ada. I then take a picture, in this case by sticking my phone in my mouth, which is a good reason never to borrow a linguist's phone. And the dark dye on my alveolar ridge shows the contact of the tip of my tongue with the alveolar ridge during the articulation of the plosive consonant. The reverse of palatography is also possible as linguaography, which is where the fixed articulators like the palate and teeth are painted with dye, and the articulation transfers dye to the tongue. Palatography has a long tradition in phonetic research. It's cheap, easy to do in fieldwork, and can provide a relatively clear picture of nuanced articulatory differences. There's also, though, a lot of good reasons not to do palatography. Most important is that palatography necessarily only works for articulations that require contact among the articulators. As such, palatography is useless for studying vowels and liquids. Furthermore, because of things like gag reflex, most informants won't tolerate their tongue being painted with dye too far back onto the body of the tongue, so it's usually not possible to study places of articulation back of the palate for most informants. And because only a single articulation of a single segment can be visualized, traditional palatography is impossible for connected speech. Palatography is experiencing something of a rebirth, though, through the development of electropalatography, or EPG. In this technique, rather than dye being painted on the tongue, a contact sensor is custom molded to an informant's palate and worn like a mouth guard, which can then detect contact points where the tongue touches it. This image from Stobie and Poplier 2010 shows contact points between the sides of the tongue and back of the tongue during productions of velarized L in English. In the diagram, the contact points show up as dark areas in the squares. However, creating an informant-specific EPG sensor is very expensive, and speaking with one is initially very uncomfortable. So at the time, EPG research remains relatively underutilized outside of phonetics laboratories. In the 1960s, phoneticians used X-rays to take pictures of articulators. Fortunately, the problems of repeatedly blasting people's faces with high levels of radiation were eventually recognized, and X-rays were abandoned as an instrumental phonetic technique. Phoneticians have since tried to leverage subsequent imaging technologies that were developed for medical applications for the purposes of articulatory research, such as MRI or fMRI. The technology, though, that has found the most phonetic applications is ultrasound, and specifically ultrasound tongue imaging, or UTI. Ultrasound is safe for informants, captures real-time video of articulations, and can be done while informants are upright talking comfortably. Unlike, for instance, MRI, where informants are stuck in a tube and it makes lots of loud growling and banging noises. Ultrasound is also increasingly available as relatively cheap wands that interface with a tablet or a good smartphone are becoming available, and as there is a market for secondhand ultrasound equipment as medical facilities upgrade their equipment. Usually, UTI is done by holding an ultrasound wand under the jaw and pointing it up toward the tongue, or by the informant wearing a headset with a mounted ultrasound wand. The tongue's shape is then traced in the resulting video, as in these tracings of an RP speaker producing L segments in a range of phonetic environments in Turton 2017. In this image, the front of the tongue is on the right of the image and the root is on the left. And the difference in shapes shows that the RP speaker uses an alveolar articulation for L at the beginning of syllables and a velar articulation for L at the end of syllables. So this is an articulatory phonetic data point that also tells us something about the phonological rules for allophones of L in English. UTI has been especially important for understanding the phonetic gestures involved in secondary articulations, like velarization in terms research or pharyngealization, as well as segments like vowels and liquids that don't involve any articulatory contact. Probably the biggest disadvantage to UTI is that ultrasound only shows soft tissues, so the tongue is very visible, but the ultrasound cannot penetrate hard structures like bones in the larynx, which creates shadows in our ultrasound images, and also ultrasound will not show articulators like the palate or the teeth. As you'd expect, UTI equipment is still mostly constrained to laboratories, but advances in the portability of the equipment are changing this. Event-related potentials, or ERPs, are an electrical response by the brain to stimuli, which can be measured through electroencephalogram. Electrical probes are stuck on an informant's head, and these monitor the brain for spikes in activity, which can help describe where the brain is producing activity and what the time intervals are for the brain to respond to them. This is an averaged ERP plot of ERPs across time from Schwab, Giroux, Meyer, and Delwo 2020, where the blue bands show spikes in respondents' neural activity. In this work, they examined ERP response to phonetic stress among French learners of English, and they found that increased sensitivity to word final stress relative to word initial or word medial stress, which is consistent with the prediction that phonological knowledge of French stress patterns will interfere with the acquisition of the English phonological stress pattern. They also found that training could increase sensitivity to English stress patterns phonologically. So here you have implications for a phonetic input to the phonological system and a phonological consequence that matters for English language learning generally, and language teaching strategies. ERP has broad implications for understanding the neural interface between phonetics and phonology, and has already been very important for studies of the perceptual apparatus. As you would expect, ERP studies are also still generally limited to a few laboratories. But again, it's increasingly likely that ERP will find applications in a wider range of linguistic research paradigms, and even potentially move into fieldwork as technology becomes cheaper and more accessible.